Today's topic for discussion is caste and class in Indian politics, and what we will be doing is to we will be looking at this issue of caste in terms of its interaction with class as well as with politics in India. In fact, one thing should be borne in mind, that without the discussion of caste, any understanding of Indian society remains incomplete. Of course, this is an institution which has existed from time immemorial, and interestingly, in fact, those predictions which basically talked about disappearance of caste after industrialization and urbanization have been falsified in Indian case, and caste has is coexisting with industrialization and urbanization, as well as it existed in the pre-industrialized and pre-urbanized India. Therefore, the caste becomes a matter of investigation and analysis in social science in a big way, and social scientists have been looking at this issue from multiple vantage points, from multiple approaches over the years, and we will be looking at those approaches in social science, that how social science has engaged with this institution, that is caste. But then there are other issues as well, particularly the way caste has influenced politics, particularly after independence, the democratic politics, and so much so that political scientists like Rajni Kothari and others started talking about politicization of caste and casteization of politics, the kind of influence which caste brought on the politics. And then of course the constitutional discourse on caste and the social structure basically looked at it in a different way. It considered all sorts of identities, including caste, to be detrimental for the birth of a democratic society, and therefore in fact didn't recognize this institution, rather tried to abolish all discriminations based on caste and similar identities, social identities, and of course also made a space for some state intervention to ameliorate the conditions of the disadvantaged people, particularly on account of caste discrimination. This is what it did in name of social justice and affirmative action. So all these issues are important when we discussed interaction between the caste and class in politics, particularly Indian politics. Now, one thing before we move ahead in our discussion, in fact, we should understand one thing, that this term caste has been given by the Portuguese language. Therefore, many people argue that it is the term is Portuguese origin. In fact, of course, the Indian translation or Indian version is normally called jati and varna. Varna is basically the fourfold division of society. There is important relationship varna and caste, and the sociologists have been looking at this relationship very closely. In fact, Varna system is called a value framework, under which this entire the caste identity or caste system operates. So the Varna system as per the scriptures or as per the shastras divides the society into fourfold varnas, and the caste system is basically the product of that fourfold division of society. In fact, and then within every caste there are many subcastes. So therefore, that creates a kind of hierarchical society. The Varna system also creates a hierarchy of four different varnas, but the caste of course goes further and creates hierarchy within the hierarchy. So therefore, what we find, that this vertical division of the society in terms of this hierarchy is a special aspect of this institution. In fact, Max Weber, the eminent German sociologist, in his writings looked at caste as a fundamental institution of Hinduism. In fact, he associated with especially the specificity of caste he found in the religion, that is Hinduism. In fact, to some extent one can say that one finds a similar echo in many Indian thinkers as well, like Ambedkar and others, who also looked at caste as a product of Hinduism as a religion. Of course, on the other hand, thinkers like Gandhi disagreed on this issue and looked at caste as a distortion of Hinduism, or one can say the Varna order, which was more duty based and the vocation based, and not the birth based division of society which caste is, and therefore he thought that it was a distortion of that entire order. We will be looking at this Gandhi Ambedkar perspective on caste as well. But one thing we should remember, that this social institution is considered fundamental to Indian society, and there is no denying the fact. In fact, one thing which is often talked about in context of India, that why India is different from the Western societies. Of course, that is sometimes also seen as exceptionalism, some sort of exceptionalism, that Indian society is different from West on account of certain things, and the caste is perhaps the most important and prominent thing, and therefore those tools and those techniques through which the Western societies can be studied and analyzed, those tools and techniques are not applicable and valid for understanding Indian society. In fact, this exceptionalism or some sort of essentialism that essentialize Indian society in terms of few identity marker, and caste is one of them, has led to a very intense debate in social science, and lot of scholars have called it a kind of Orientalist construct. Those scholars in the West looked at the Orient in general and India in particular as something different, and therefore in fact this was part of the larger imperialist discourse, which was basically meant to civilize these countries which differed from the Western society in terms of certain civilizational values, and therefore this West versus India, the class in this entire argument, the class is normally pitted against the caste, because Western society is believed to be based on the principle of class division, and the class division is one division which is related to people's occupation, their position in the class in the economic structure of society, which also allows lot of mobility. One can one can be born in a particular class, but with his or her labor, initiative, effort, he or she can move away from that class and can acquire a new class status. So therefore the mobility is a special feature of the class, whereas in caste it is argued that it is not an immobile system, because people are born in a particular caste and they die also in the same caste, because there is no mobility permissible, no mobility allowed in this institution. So therefore this is one important feature of this system which differentiates it from the class structure or class system on which the entire Western society is based. In fact, this is something we also find in the writings of Karl Marx, particularly in 1857, when he was writing some newspaper pieces for the New York Daily Tribunes. In fact, in those writings, particularly in aftermath of 1857, this revolt in India, what Marx argued that the British rule in India would be playing or was playing, in his opinion at that time, a mixed role, role of destruction as well as regeneration. Destruction as a colonial power, the Britishers were simply interested in looting and plundering resources, but the regenerative role or the constructive role Marx saw in terms of industrialization of the society, or giving birth to capitalism through number of measures which were being taken around that time, particularly the introduction of railway system, the postal and telegraph, the entire communication network, and little amount of industrialization and urbanization. And therefore Marx believed that due to these interventions and these measures undertaken by the British rule in India, the colonial rule in India, caste as an institution, which is the basis of India's stagnation, would be broken. Particularly the railway system will break this entire system of untouchability, because people would travel in the same compartment, and therefore that kind of distance which is basically maintained within the system would not be possible, and therefore the caste system as the backbone of this India's stagnation would be broken. And it is on this front that Marx saw colonialism playing some very important and positive role. So therefore what we find that someone like Marx who was a great critic of capitalism and also colonialism and imperialism. But when it came to India, he also looked at capitalism to be playing, or colonialism to be playing some important role in terms of destruction of this caste institution, which in his opinion was the basis for India's backwardness. Now, a lot of scholars, a lot of people have criticized Marx and Marxist writing on this account, saying that his entire idea on caste was, or Indian society was colored by that Eurocentrism. Being a European, he was also looking at India through the same prism of exceptionalism and essentialism, which characterized most of the writings coming from or emanating from the West. Now, even in the colonial rulers, in fact, were divided on this issue, particularly dealing with some of the institutions, social institutions, and the caste was a very important institution for them. In fact, we find that the larger debate which took place among the colonial rulers and administrators was along this line, the Anglicist versus Orientalist. The Anglicists were those who wanted to transform India into the image of the West, and thought that they had a civilizational, they had some responsibility to discharge in countries like India, and therefore if they were ruling over India, then they should also allow their value system to come and prevail in these societies which were backward, uncivilized, and it was not possible for them to modernize on basis of their own values. So that was the Anglicist line. On the other hand, there was also Orientalist line, which argued that no point disturbing this old ancient structure which has survived the test of the time. Rather, we should simply adore it, we should preserve it, they are the museum materials, and we should allow Indian people to live their lives on their own terms. So, no point disturbing this such social institutions. So, Anglicist and Orientalist debate is a very well known debate so far as the colonial discourse in India is concerned. Of course, one thing we should remember, that finally the Anglicist line prevailed, and Macaulay was one of the Anglicist, the protagonist among the Anglicists, because through him the entire modern English education came to India. But then there are others who were also arguing for the Orientalist line, for example Burke and many other similar thinkers were basically were believing in terms of preserving this institution. So therefore, in fact, this debate, the Anglicist and Orientalist debate, is also important on other issues also, but the caste was also one of the important reference point. Now, one thing we should remember, that the caste and class have occupied a very important, they have attracted the attention, drawn the attention of social scientists in a big way. Not only after independence, but even before independence. For example, in fact, what we find that during colonial period, when anthropology as a new discipline started taking root in India, and some of the scholars started working on India, some ethnographic studies were done on India, along with some administrators who were quite social scientific in their approach, and their account through gazetteers and many other writings, kind of reports from the field which they maintained. All these things also provided some understanding about the functioning of this institution in society, because before that we have had only the understanding of caste on basis of either scriptures or shastras, or perhaps in terms of the lived experience of the people. But this type of understanding for the first time we started developing from the people who were not part of this culture in this society. So therefore, one can say that a kind of external perspective on Indian social system, particularly the caste system, started crystallizing, and hence we find that a lot of ethnographical studies and administrators' account are available from that period. Now, of course, the major breakthrough came after independence. In the post-independent India, what we find that proliferation of caste studies happened in different branches of social science, particularly sociology, anthropology, political science, and history. Both the Westerners, the Western scholars as well as the Indian scholars took to such studies. And hence we find that whole host of eminent sociologists, anthropologists, political scientists, historians came to analyze and study this institution, that is caste. Now, for example, I can cite the name of Louis Domo, the French sociologist, F.G. Bailly, Claude Malichou, of course Africanist, but in fact he wrote a very interesting and powerful piece on India. Are there caste in India? Because being a Marxist, he thought that it is nothing but a class structure, only camouflaged through this ideology or certain value system. Then Godelia, another very eminent Marxist anthropologist. Some Indians like M.N. Srinivas, a pioneer of Indian sociology, Andre Bethe, political scientists like Rajni Kothari, Rudolph and Rudolph, Lloyd and Susan Haber Rudolph. So therefore, these are some of the important names which can be cited, who provided a very very profound understanding of caste and its working in Indian society, and on basis of both the textual interpretation which Dumo did and many others who did field work, and basically analyze caste on basis of its real functioning on the ground. So therefore, both types of understanding started developing in the post-independent period largely on account of intervention by both Western and Indian social scientists. We will be looking at some of these scholars, particularly in terms of their ideological affinities as well as their loyalty to certain methodological schools in social science. But one thing is very clear, that if we look at the whole host of writings on caste, normally you find some sort of ideological division as well, and that division can be seen in terms of the liberals and the Marxists, because there are some scholars who are using the tools and techniques of analysis and research which are essentially or broadly called liberal pluralist, whereas there are other scholars who essentially believe in that orthodox Marxist formulation of base superstructure and the class division of society, and accordingly try to look at the caste as well. Of course, the purpose of these two ideological schools is also different behind the study of this caste. The liberals normally try to look at this institution in terms of its function, its contribution in the larger social cohesion, particularly in terms of their role in as a facilitator or as an obstacle for democratic process. They look at this institution as a social institution, as a cultural institution, and also try to understand that how people relate themselves with this institution, what type of value system they offer, and how people find meaning for their life through these social structures. So therefore, this is broadly the ideological this is a liberal line of thinking so far as the study of caste is concerned. So but the Marxist scholars are concerned, they essentially look at this institution from the point of view of revolutionary politics, because for them the real politics starts with the revolution. Every society has to go through the process of revolution for transformation, regeneration and liberation. And revolution, as Marx declared, that is a midwife, particularly in the birth of the new society. So what happens that for Marxists, the class becomes the important tool through which they try to study any social formation. Now, of course, as the famous statement of Karl Marx goes, that history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggle. But when they come to India, they find that instead of class, there is another social division in society, that is the caste division, and people relate themselves with this identity more than their class positions, and that completely trouble them, intrigue them, that why this has happened. In fact, earlier, of course, they thought that it was a product of the pre-capitalist social formation, the feudal, it had its relationship with the feudal social structure. But after some amount of capitalism started developing in Indian society, and still caste system didn't disappear, rather it survived, then perhaps it became more troubling for them that how to explain this phenomenon, because it is coexisting with capitalism, it coexisted with feudalism, and it is not ready to go. So therefore, they have to study this institution if really they have to theorize Indian revolution. So therefore, for Marxists, it is done from altogether different point of view. We look at some internal divisions among Marxists as well. They are relatively more homogeneous than the liberals in terms of their approach towards caste, but nonetheless there is also a division among the Marxist school, particularly between the two schools of thought, one which can be called class reductionist, as well as other one which can be called the relative autonomist. So therefore, these are the two divisions among the Marxists. So far the liberals are concerned, there are three lines along which the liberal scholars could be studied or could be divided or could be presented. The variants, the ovarians, the structural functionalist and the structuralist. These are the three dominant perspectives on Indian caste system so far as the liberal school of thought in India is concerned. And in social science, and the Weberians particularly are those who are wedded to the Weber's framework of study, Weber's understanding of caste system, Weber's tripartite division or stratification of society, that is status, class and power or party. And then you have the structural functionalists, which is basically operationalizing the same tool, same framework which has been provided by structural functionalists school of thought in 50s and 60s, particularly after the advent of this method in comparative politics. And then you have the structuralists as well, who essentially try to operationalize the categories and the framework coming from the French structuralist tradition, particularly Lévi-Strauss and others. Among the Marxists also we find two schools of thought, as I mentioned earlier also. One is the class reductionist, who argue that caste is nothing but class. It is only an ideology which is basically camouflaging this major contradiction, which is a class contradiction. So therefore, if you mobilize people on basis of class and if you try to generate that consciousness among people, caste would automatically disappear, because it is nothing but simply a kind of false consciousness. It is a smoke screen which is trying to conceal the reality. So this is a classical Marxist line which was followed by many Marxist scholars in India and many political parties which were trying to bring revolution as per the Marxist formulation. So therefore, in fact, this is the one line. The second is the relative autonomous, which are basically late comers so far as the Marxist analysis of caste is concerned, and they are essentially drawing on again a structuralist tradition, but within Marxism, particularly coming from Althusser and Godelier, the two the French structuralists, Marxists, and they are trying to look at caste slightly in autonomous terms, not fully autonomous the way perhaps liberals would like to do it. Some of the liberals, and not the Weberians, but many liberals would simply not try to relate it to the class structure. But the Marxists only want to give relative autonomy to the caste institution, that it is one institution which cannot be reduced purely to the class structure or the economic structure of society as it was done earlier. Rather, they believe that it has some sort of autonomy from economy, and therefore this autonomous character has to be understood. And in politics also, in revolution also, this autonomous character of caste has to be respected and understood properly, that why people are not getting mobilized on basis of class identity, why people are not responding to the class call, why people are attaching more value to the caste position, why the poor and the rich people belonging to the same caste, the poor and rich people belonging to they come together on basis of the caste identity. Otherwise, on basis of the class division, they should have some conflicts, which are the real conflict according to the Marxist theory, that is the class, the conflict interest of conflict of interest. So therefore, these are the four two divisions within the Marxism and three divisions within the liberal school. Among the liberal scholars, particularly on the issue of caste, we can identify some scholars who have tried to operationalize different method given associated with the different schools of thought which I have identified here. In fact, so far as the Weberians are concerned, one can put Andre Bethe, a leading sociologist of India, in fact as the main pioneer so far as the Weberian method to study caste institution in India is concerned. Particularly his very important book or path breaking book, Caste, Class and Power, which is based on the study of one village in Tamil Nadu, in fact is a basically very good example and that how he tries to operationalize this Weberian method so far as the study of caste is concerned. Like Weber, Bethe also argued that a caste is a status group and class has a relationship with economy. The way Weber related it to the market, one's position in the market, in fact Weber's definition of Bethe's definition of class is not much different. Now through his very empirically oriented study, Bethe comes to certain conclusions and in his writings, and one of the important argument which Bethe puts forth is that in traditional society the three things, that is the caste, class and power, if we associate caste with status, class and power in Weberian framework, then Bethe would say that all these three things were fused. There was no differentiation among these three institutions, and the particularly one who was who was basically strong in terms of the caste position was also in the class position as well as the power. So class and power were fused and subsumed within the caste structure. That was the main structure in society. But of course, with some changes, starting with the colonial period and later in the post-independent period, many transformations have happened and therefore the caste institution has also undergone changes. Now one can see some differentiation in these three positions of people in society, that is caste, status, the caste, class and power. The class thing has happened largely due to the infusion of capital and the market, power because of the introduction of democratic process and adult enfranchise, and caste because of some factors leading to urbanization, industrialization and economic change. So therefore now the earlier fusion between the three is no longer true and now they have become autonomous. So therefore Andre Bethe tries to great extent operationalize this Weberian framework so far as understanding of caste is concerned. Now after these Weberians, we can have a look at the structuralists like Louis Dumont, particularly his famous tract called Homo Hierarchicus. In fact, unlike Bethe who operationalizes Weberian framework, or the structural functionalists who have operationalized structural functionalist method, Louis Dumont essentially operationalized structuralist perspective of Levi-Strauss, and particularly the way the Straussian framework talks about rules through which the structures function. So therefore Dumont also tried to find out underlying rules of this system, that is caste, and he identified 4-5 important rules of this functioning of this caste system. And one is the hierarchy, another is holism, then is the purity pollution, the disjunction between status and power. These are the important rules through which this entire system operates, and he tries to argue that these are the rules which should be understood, because these are the rules on basis of which this entire caste system operates in India. Of course, there are many criticisms of this approach, which tries to find out, which tries to offer certain rules underneath this structure on this basis that it is highly textual, particularly this disjunction between status and power, that the way Dumont argues that one of the important feature of caste system is that there is a disjunction between status and power. Those who are superior in terms of status are not supposed to wield power. For example, the Brahmins as per the status structure is superior to the Kshatriya, but they are not supposed to wield power, and the power will be wielded only by Kshatriya who comes next to the Brahmins. So therefore this disjunction between status and power, and then this kind of dialectics in this hierarchy between purity and pollution, particularly the way the purity and pollution are antagonistic to each other, but as well as also related to each other, because for the existence of one the other is required. Without purity, the pollution has no meaning, and for pollution the purity has to be there. So therefore, and then the holism, and through this entire understanding of holism, he tries to construct this entire image of a society based on this hierarchy. So therefore, what we find that these structural rules of differentiation operating through caste is basically the main reference point of this structuralist scholar Louis Dumont. In fact, he studies ideological dimension of caste and gives importance to religion also, that how this entire legitimacy, the entire value system, this entire ideological dimension has come from the religion, that is Hinduism, because that is perhaps the main governing principle on through which this caste system operates. Then the third school among the liberal scholars in social science is the structural functionalist school, and here I can identify two important scholars. The Rudolphs, when I say Rudolphs, that means the wife husband Lloyd Rudolph and Susan Howard Rudolph, and Rajni Kothari. Particularly, the Rudolphs wrote a very important and powerful discourse on caste, that is the modernity of tradition, and Rajni Kothari is a book that is Caste in Indian Politics. So these two writings, these two writings give us some understanding that how a structural functionalist method would analyze caste system in India, because their major reference point is that how caste functions in a democratic setup. Because after independence, when the entire democratic process started in India, of course the Western scholars were quite skeptical about the prospect of the survival of democracy in India. They thought that in fact that Indian democracy would not succeed. That is a different question. Number of issues were cited in support of this argument: illiteracy, poverty, but also the caste, because caste division in society would not allow the modern institutions to survive and function. But when these scholars started using the tools of structural functionalism, they wanted to study that how caste is operating within this democratic setup, and they basically argued on basis of their empirical findings that caste has not only existed, is not only coexisting with democratic process, but is also transforming itself and transforming democracy both. So therefore, politicization of caste has happened, and the casteization of politics simultaneously also materializes. Now how this happens? Because of two things. Number one, they argue that the caste has performed a democratic role in Indian context, and that role is something we all should acknowledge. That role is largely the role of a pressure group, because in India, unlike the Western societies, India lacked many things which were required for democracy, particularly in civil society institutions like pressure group and interest group and other things, something which Tocqueville gave a lot of importance in context of his study of American democracy. But in India, these things were lacking, and therefore many scholars were very skeptical that how India would operate this liberal institutions and liberal democratic process in absence of many things which are required for the success of democracy and democratic process. But Kothari and Rudolphs, they discovered that caste started performing the role of a pressure group. Particularly in terms of mobilizing people, particularly in terms of bringing people into the electoral and democratic process, particularly in terms of educating them about politics. So all important roles which normally are performed by pressure groups in democracy were performed by the caste associations. So therefore, they studied caste associations which were proliferating even in the colonial period. In fact, a lot of historians, particularly the Cambridge School of History, is known for their path-breaking study of the role of caste associations and identity politics in colonial period, particularly in terms of their argument that how nationalism in India developed and how the caste identities played important role, particularly due to certain changes brought about by the colonial rule in India, including the census and also the democratic elections and democratic process at the local level. So Bailey and other historians of the Cambridge School have studied the role of caste associations in context of the rise of nationalism, where they argue that nationalism was basically the product of colonialism and imperialism, because after all the Indian society witnessed this new alien ideology, birth of alien ideology, due to some extraneous factors, and those factors could be related to the colonial rule. So therefore, that is a different issue altogether. But why I mentioned these Cambridge historians and their study of caste association, because they have also studied the role and working of caste associations in terms of bringing political consciousness among people, the kind of unity which it forged. But in post-independent India, particularly Rajani Kothari and the Rudolphs have looked at their role in democratic role in terms of the electoral process, particularly the role of caste associations, that how they have performed and discharged the duty of a pressure group in Indian politics, and therefore in terms of the participation of people in elections, which was not a mean achievement for Indian politics, Indian democratic politics, because of illiteracy, poverty and number of other problems through which plagued Indian society. What we find that people started participating in this electoral process, and as we know that over the years the participation has increased manifold, and these scholars, by using the tools of structural functionalism, which argues that how structure functions in a particular context should be analyzed and studied, because all structures have their value only in terms of the functions they discharge and perform. That is perhaps one important argument given by the structural functionalism as a method. So what functions a particular structure or institution offer, and only that function can give identity to that structure. And therefore, in terms of their study of the caste, role of caste in politics, democratic politics, they believe that caste has played important role in politicization and democratization of society. In other words, they have argued that what has happened in India is a modernization of tradition, that traditional structures instead of becoming an obstacle for the modernization of society, including the democratization of society, they are becoming the facilitator of social change through democracy. So therefore, this is a structural functionalist approach. So these are the three important approaches in social science coming from the liberal school of thought. Then you have the Marxist approach to caste, which I have already hinted earlier, that there are two divisions. One is the class reductionist, another is the relative autonomist. The class reductionists are those who basically rely and base their argument on the classical Marxist formulations, which argued that caste to disappear with industrialization and urbanization. As we can see, that kind of optimism Marx had in his New York Daily Tribune writings, particularly after 1857, the kind of changes which he discovered taking place in India. But this classical Marxist formulation has been taken further by a whole host of Marxist thinkers, scholars, political leaders and ideologues, and the communist parties are also can be considered part of this larger framework of analysis. These class reductionists argue that it is an ideology like all other ideology. This is also a false consciousness, and therefore in fact one should not give much credence or importance to this this identity. Rather, one should simply base one politics on basis of class, which is a fundamental division of society, and in India also that division is there, and that division has only been camouflaged by this ideology, that is caste. So therefore, we should organize the deprived, we should organize the working class, we should organize the peasantry, and automatically when the organization will come, when the consciousness will come, the class consciousness will come through the role of political parties, they will overcome this obscurantist ideology or obstructionist ideology called caste. So this is perhaps the class class reductionist line. Then you have the relative autonomist on caste, and here, as I mentioned, they are mostly drawing on again the French structuralist tradition, but belonging to the Marxist tradition. And here Louis Althusser and Godelier can be cited as two important inspiration. And in Indian context, this line of argument has been promoted, or one can say had been taken forward by Gail Ombart and some other Marxist scholars, activists. So, this relative autonomy school argues within Marxism that caste is to be seen as a autonomous unit, relatively autonomous unit in terms of its functioning from the class, and it cannot be reduced purely to to the class structure. In fact, this relative autonomy issue is to be seen again within the framework of the classical Marxism, particularly the way Marx talked about the relative autonomy of the state, particularly in his writing 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. But that argument for the state, relative autonomy for the state, has been used in many other areas, including culture and superstructural realm like culture and identities by the subsequent Marxists, particularly those who tried to develop or theorize the superstructural dimension of society, because the base, that is economic structure, was extensively theorized earlier. So, the two traditions, one coming from Althusser, another coming from Gramsci, have looked at the this issue, that is how to theorize the superstructural realm of society and a sphere of society, and therefore they have extended this relative autonomy argument, which was given in context of a state, to superstructural reality as well. And in context of India, on issue of caste, this entire thing is basically the product of that perspective, which emanates from this relative autonomist perspective on base superstructure relationship. So, therefore, earlier caste was reduced to class and therefore was made the part of the basic structure of society, but the relative autonomists would like to give some autonomy and would say that this caste has to be seen on autonomous, not fully autonomous like liberal, but slightly relatively autonomous term. That why even if it is a smoke screen, why this is a smoke screen is so efficient, why people are being guided by this ideology, why it is not disappearing even in urban context, why it is coexisting with urbanization, industrialization and capitalism. These are some of the poses they have made, and accordingly they have tried to analyze this issue. Now, what we find that these are the important perspectives in social science, but then of course we also have to look at this issue in politics, particularly how caste and class have been influencing politics. As we know that during freedom movement, number of discourses and contestations were circulating so far as the rights, the rights of different groups, the representation of different groups in politics is concerned. So, social justice and representation were the two most important and the salient aspects of colonial politics among Indian people. And as you know that social reform movements also address many issues, including the caste discrimination. One can give the example of Arya Samaj movement, one can give the example of particularly the Jyotiba Phule, the social reformer, and some of the moderates leader like Ranade and Gokhale. In fact, even the this Ram Mohan Roy and the entire tradition of Brahmo Samaj also tried to address this issue. Even Vivekanand tried to address this issue, that how this is not allowing Indian people to unite for the cause of nation and nationalism. So, therefore, social reform movement raised this issue in a big way. But in 20th century, we really find that most powerful discourse on this caste and class in politics started with the self-respect movement in different parts of the country. And here one cannot forget the famous debate between Gandhi and Ambedkar on this issue. Of course, the immediate context was the issue of representation, particularly the separate electorates which the Britishers had given to some religious groups, but when they wanted to extend it to the depressed classes, as they were called then, in fact it resulted into very fierce debate between Gandhi and Ambedkar, to the extent that Gandhi went on to fast unto death in the jail, and finally that famous or one can say that Pune Pact was signed between the two leaders. So, what was the issue between the two? In fact, to begin with Ambedkar, he looked at caste as the product of religion, that is Hinduism, which was done earlier also, as I have mentioned, by Weber, Dumo and many others. But Ambedkar looked at caste in terms of the ascending order of reverence and descending order of contempt. That is his famous statement, and he thought that this was the important feature of the caste system. Ambedkar argued that division of labor is a feature of all civilizations, but what is specific about caste is that there is not only division of labor but also division among laborers or division of laborers. So this is something he argued. Now Gandhi, on the other hand, and therefore Ambedkar thought that unless the caste and Varna both are product of Hinduism, are associated with the religion, and the religious reform is done, these institutions cannot disappear. And his famous book was Annihilation of Caste. He wanted to annihilate caste, and thereby only a democratic society can be thought of. Gandhi, on the other hand, believed that caste was a distortion of Varna and the religion, and therefore this distortion should be addressed. So far the Varna system is concerned, he thought that it was essentially based on one's vocation in life or division or duties which one is supposed to discharge or the role one is performing. It had nothing to do with the birth, and it was not fixed, but over the years it became birth based, and thereby the degeneration and distortion started. Even the gender issue came up in the discussion, that how it is enmeshed in this caste system, and Jyotiba Phule had raised this issue in a big way. So therefore you have this thing during the colonial period. Then the constitution also addressed this issue in a big way, when it abolished caste discrimination, particularly untouchability, and also declared secularism as a feature of the constitution, which has been endorsed by the judiciary, that is Supreme Court, from time to time, when it basically created a society based on principle of equality before law, that is Article 14, and non-discrimination as secularism, that is 15, but gave space for some positive discrimination in favor of those who were discriminated traditionally and historically, that is Article 16, in particularly jobs and services. So therefore non-discrimination and positive discrimination based on certain objective conditions was the hallmark of this entire constitutional discourse, through which it tried to address the question of caste, and then also gave representation based on caste to some suppressed groups. Then of course when it comes to democratic process, we believe that election and the use of caste has been going on, and the structural functionalists, as I mentioned, that have studied it in terms of voting behavior. Caste based political parties has proliferated. Caste as an interest group and pressure group is to be seen, and then you also find that caste violence, particularly in terms of the private army and the mobilization by somehow some left extremist groups called Naxalites and the other, particularly in terms of taking care of the interest of the oppressed caste, is also the feature of this thing. So therefore one can see that even in era of globalization, caste identity is continuing, and it has coexisted with number of systems and number of social changes over the years.